My name is Heather Wokusch, and thank you for joining us in another of the Manhattan Neighborhood Network series on the broader implications of war. Now, today we're going to talk about a subject that is something of a dirty little secret inside the United States, but it is a subject that is absolutely critical to understand when understanding the history of our country, and that is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, the bottom line is, after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, Japanese Americans faced increasing discrimination and an increasingly difficult time just living their everyday normal lives. Now, essentially in 1942, roughly 110,000 Japanese Americans were interned in camps. Now, sometimes people hear camp and they think of a summer camp or some kind of easygoing situation. Think more concentration camp. Yes, we had them in this country, and Japanese Americans were subjected to them. Now, the bottom line is these camps were not equally distributed. The Japanese Americans who lived along the West Coast, pretty much 100% of those people were put into internment camps. However, oddly enough, at the time there were roughly 150,000 Japanese Americans living in Hawaii, and only possibly like 1,500 of those people were put into internment camps, and so it was not equally distributed, and in that sense there was not really much, it was more madness than somehow method to that. Now, the bottom line, you might ask, well, how on earth did they say that this was legal to do this? It was a very tricky thing. At the time, of course, the president was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in 1942, they passed a kind of law that said that the military could set up certain zones, and in those zones, certain people would be excluded. Now, that was the first step. And then what they said is, okay, well, along the West Coast, Japanese Americans or people who are of Japanese ancestry will be excluded, which was amazing. And so you had essentially then at that point, it gave it a kind of legal basis to tell Japanese Americans who were law-abiding citizens who had lived there for a while, raised families, to tell them, okay, well, you're just going to have to leave your house now. You're going to have to leave your belongings. You're going to have to sell your business. And of course, if you have to sell your business in 2 days, you're not going to get enough money for it. If you have a house, what are you going to do? And you're going to have to pick up and just go, because now you're just not legal here. It's just stunning to think that this happened in the United States, but it did. And the bottom line is that the conditions in these so-called camps were extremely harsh. Barbed wire, and it was cold. People had come from the West Coast and were shipped to possibly Wyoming or similar places. They didn't have warm clothes, and you've got small kids and there's not enough food. And so the bottom line is that this is a very important part of our history to look at, and we are thrilled and delighted today to welcome Madeleine Sugimoto. Thank you so much for having joined us today. You were in these camps when you were a child.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about your life before all of this broke?
Well, I was going to the first grade and was very happy with friends.
And you were living in California?
And living in the San Joaquin Valley.
Okay.
It's called Central Valley or San Joaquin Valley. And so it was a very happy time for me with friends and being able to do what I would as a child do. But I think the time when I knew something very important and serious was happening was because there was a curfew, and one of the evenings, my father had been told that he should be careful because he besides being an artist, was teaching Japanese language school. And so some of his Caucasian friends said, Henry, you better be careful because you're on the FBI list. And what happened was one evening, a car drove up, and this was curfew time, so we thought it's somebody that we don't expect. And my father looked out the window, and it was dark, and he said to my mother, I think you better bring the case that I have upstairs, because he had a sense that he might be taken away. So he had prepared a small case with some of his belongings and clothes and things like that.
Curfew time, was that only for Japanese Americans?
Yes.
Okay, and this was before or after Pearl Harbor? This was before.
I can't remember
Okay.
what time it was, but I think it would have been after, because now that you ask me this, it jars my memory remembering that my grandfather had a very good friend who was taken away by the FBI. And so there was something already going on. And I remember the man's family, his daughter and wife, came over and was telling my grandfather, and we lived together in two houses adjacent to each other. And they said, our father has been taken away by the FBI. So with that, I think, was the indication that things were already happening. And so when my father's friends warned him, he had a sense that he could be another person to be taken by them.
And so at that point, it was primarily men that they were taking.
Yes.
When were you taken as well? Was the whole family,
Yes.
relocate? How did that happen?
Well, they would post up a sign that indicated that we were to be evacuated. And the minute that sign went up in the town areas, then approximately 48 hours afterwards, that area would be the ones where the evacuation would take place.
Okay.
And it was a standard sign that said that Japanese Americans were to be moved out. And that you could only take certain things with you. It was indicating you should bring some bedclothes and dishes or utensils for eating, and towels and things like that. Well, of course, and if you only carry what you can carry in suitcases, most of the things like bedclothes, sheets, towels, and things like that would fill up the cases, and so that's basically what people were trying to do, is take what was required and then be ready in 48 hours to leave your home.
Now, as a little girl, I mean, how did you process all of this? How could you possibly understand what was going on?
Well, there's a picture in that my father had painted, and I remember because it was a canvas-covered truck, and all of us were to go into that truck. And I remember that the adults said, oh, you better come to the front of the truck because you're going to get squashed in the back, because everybody was standing. And so I remember, and there was in the truck, once we got in there, then they had this little wooden post that they would put in front of us, and I was standing right next to it so that I could be able to breathe and not be smothered by all the adults, because they were all standing up in that. So in one of the pictures that you could see. And
well, actually, maybe now is a very good time to say a little bit about your father. Your father was a very famous artist. And so, Henry Sugimoto, can you tell us a little bit about his art?
Yes, my father went to the California College of Arts and Crafts, which is now the California College of Arts. And then he went to San Francisco Institute of Art. And after he graduated from there, he was very interested in going to France. So he actually stayed in France for 3 years. And
you have a French name, so
yes, Madeleine, right?
So he always loved France, I would say.
And so he studied there, and then came back and was painting basically in oil and canvas, and wood block prints and whatever he had learned as far as being an artist and how to do the various kinds of creative work. And he did that as well as helping with my grandparents who owned a hand laundry. So he did some of the mangling of the sheets and things besides being an artist, of course.
Okay. But interestingly enough, now your father's art has provided a historical record for what happened inside the camps. And as such, your father's art has been hung around the world, literally. And so it's very critical to look at these paintings to try to understand what possibly had happened. Now, I understand that the Japanese American National Museum has a permanent exhibit of his art?
The documentary paintings of the internment experience, which my father wanted to have some museum or place that would have it because of the historical significance. So after he passed away and knowing his wishes, I donated them to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles.
Oh, that's wonderful. And this is possibly not connected, but I was fascinated. Your father's father was a samurai?
The family goes back a long ways, and apparently, yes, that title does belong in the family.
Okay, I mean, what a fascinating, colorful background. Anyway, I just had to reconfirm that. So you had this horrific experience. You were uprooted, and somehow, as a little girl, you had to leave your home. No one could understand that. Where did you go from there? Which camp were you in?
Well, we first went to what it was called an assembly center, and they had them in various areas.
Okay.
And they were considered the temporary places that we lived in, and probably 3 or 4 months or more, but just months. And then what was happening at that time was that the government was building the different campsites.
Okay.
So there were 10 of them in the United States. And they were all just like what I understand would be the way the Army or the service members would live in barracks.
So they weren't set up for people with kids? They weren't set up for families?
That's right. It was just very practical in the sense of having these tar paper covered barracks, and with different units, they would call, so that there was an entrance way to the various rooms, which we were supplied single bed cots.
Okay.
And I think that by dimensions, probably no more than 4 or 5 of a family could be in one unit. So if you're a larger family, then you would have had several.
Okay.
But you had no connection. Each of the units had a separate entranceway, so it was really just very living quarters, basically.
Yeah. And actually, I would like to go back just a moment. During that 48 hours that you got this sign that you had to go, what about your non-Japanese neighbors? Did anybody come up and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry, can I help you?" Or were they kind of scared? Or
well, it was a mixture, actually, because my father had gone to the high school in Hanford.
Okay.
And several of his, what he thought was very good friends, absolutely turned and didn't want to have anything to do with them.
Okay.
But then we had some other people, which turned out to be a wonderful thing. They were very brave. Ben and Mary Powell were a couple that said, "We will, when you leave, we will come and live and stay in your house for you."
Oh, thank goodness.
And so what happened was, fortunately, because they lived there, when my grandparents were able to leave the camp, they were able to go back to that house because it was there and had been occupied. If it wasn't, somebody could have occupied it and say squatters' rights and say, we live here and you don't. But because of this couple, my grandparents were able to go back to the same house.
Well, you just raised a really important point that I think that a lot of people don't know. You know, during that same time period, of course, you had the Nazis kicking people out of their homes in Germany and taking their homes. And in not only Germany, but also Poland and other countries. We don't ever think that, indeed, in the United States, you also had Japanese people losing their homes because they were sent away, and then they came back and they said, well, I'm sorry, this isn't your property anymore, it's mine. You know, and I understand that the IRS ended up just destroying a lot of records regarding who owned what. And so people just had to start from nothing at the end of it. So thank goodness at least you had your house and you could start with that.
Right.
So then you ended up in this cramped quarters. And what was it like adapting to that kind of experience?
Well, I think the interesting thing for me is, as a child, I didn't experience anything really traumatic or sad, and that's because I was with my parents.
Okay.
But I imagine that the adults among themselves spoke about the sadness and the humiliation, but it was not something that I ever verbally heard.
Okay.
And it's only after I was older that I realized and could see and understand that for them it was a terrible experience of being uprooted and not being able to have any control over anything, that you had to just do what the government said that they had to do, and then to live the way we did. And
the tricky thing too is that living the way that you did, as you said, nobody knew what would come next. You know, I mean, are we going to be killed? Are we ever going to go free? You know, I mean, it must have been just psychologically devastating to live in that kind of limbo where you completely lose control. And what I found very interesting is that in the legality of setting this up, they said, well, we had to do it because there was a potential danger from, you know, these Japanese American citizens. But in fact, you know, the bulk of, there were a majority were children. Pretty much nobody had ever posed any danger. And, you know, none of these people had posed any danger to the United States beforehand. And what I found interesting is at the end of the war, a total of 10 people actually had proven to be some kind of spies for Japan, and all of them were Caucasian. You know, so you know, obviously the whole thing was not really about security. When you look back now as an adult to this time, what do you think this period in our history was about?
Well, I think it's a combination of the politics as well as the fact that there was land that was very, very prized in California, and some of that, I think, influenced the way that decisions were made so that it became a necessity.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you mean by that?
Well, I know that since the investigations went on later on with what had happened, that it was discovered there were the Japanese immigrants bought land and felt that they would be able to make a living, and so farming was a big part of it in the San Joaquin Valley. And what they did was they started what was called irrigation farming, which meant that they were able to make the land that was considered worthless into very, very valuable land for growing fruits and vegetables. And so the farmers that thought that they sold this useless land were very, very jealous and angry that they lost this land, because they could have, if they could see that it's become very valuable and very productive. Okay. So what happened was that there was a lot of pressure for moving people out, one being questionable as far as loyalty, but also the politics of saying that there was this very valuable land that they thought was worthless, and now the farmers could do something with it, and they wanted it back. So they could, in the sense that the Japanese immigrants, their families, but when they left, because they weren't citizens, they couldn't have deeds to the land, so it was a two-edged sword. Okay. You couldn't become a citizen even if you wanted to, because the Congress didn't permit it with alien land, alien laws, and then because they weren't United States citizens that they couldn't have deed to the property. So basically, there was no way to really hang on to it. And once they went to camp, that was it. They lost the property. Unless, like us, we had fortunate friends who stayed and lived on the land, so that my grandparents could go back, even though they couldn't prove that they had a deed, which was often the case.
Yeah. I mean, how often do these things boil down to politics and money and greed?
And the politics that really pushes certain things to happen.
Indeed, indeed.
And so it's a question about legality as well as the politics, I think.
Exactly. What I would like to do just for a moment, there's this, I'm sure you know Densho, that has this amazing archive of different photographs and clearly about the Japanese internment experience. We have a couple of posters here during that time, and I think the content of this will be shocking for people nowadays, because this is the kind of thing that you were facing before. I'd like to just show one or two of these up. Here we go. Here is one, and again, these are courtesy of Densho. And so basically, if you worked as hard and as fast as a Jap, then you can smash them a lot quicker. So, I mean, when you see this, what comes into your mind?
Well, it's the cruelty and the anger that was created out of people who were once the neighbors and friends of a community, and that the anger and hatred that can just boil up out of something like this, because it's really the citizens feeling a threat, that we are a threat to the country.
That's a really good point. And I'd like to show just one more. So Jap trap, there you go. So, I mean, clearly, like you say, it's dehumanizing, literally dehumanizing people of Japanese ancestry. But it's so violent, And so my question to you now, how long were you actually in this internment camp?
We were there for 3 years.
3 years?
3 years. And, well, for me, because the government organized schools, we actually had grade school, elementary school, through high school. And my father taught art in the high school, and my mother, because she had gone to college too, was teaching first grade. So for children, I think it was fairly normal in the sense that we were with family and we went to school and we had our playmates around.
Okay.
So that to me, remembering it is that it was a happy time because all my friends were close by. They were in the barracks right next door, which is easier than or closer than we would have been if we lived in the community.
Yeah.
So it was fun. But I have to tell you, one of the things, I loved ice cream, and I still do. But there was a PX, and the PX was where we could purchase soap and toothpaste and things like that, which we needed. And I remember that they were selling ice cream cones. And I said to my mother, "Isn't it terrible? They're so mean. They sell the ice cream cones. There's no ice cream." So what I did was my mother bought me a package of the ice cream cones, and I'd take the empty cone with me to the mess hall. And when they served Jell-O, I would put the Jell-O on the ice cream cone. That was the closest I could get to having.
Oh my goodness!
But those are funny kinds of things that you remember as a youngster.
But now, can I ask you? Possibly this is a silly question, but how did you get money to buy things in the PX?
Well, there was work in which the government would pay people to do it.
Okay.
And my mother and father were teachers, and so they got $19 a month.
Okay.
And if you did something like working in the mess hall as a dishwasher or a cook on the different blocks, then they would get $16 a month. So people got money for doing a specific kind of work.
Okay. Now, during this time, I mean, Or did you feel, or do you remember anybody saying that they felt physically threatened, or that, if they tried to escape, they'd be killed, or something of that nature?
Well, it's interesting because there was an incident. It wasn't in the camp that I was in, as far as I know, but there was a grandfather and child who were playing catch.
Okay.
And near the barbed wire fence,
Okay.
and the ball went under the fence, and he went under it, and he was killed because
the grandfather or the child?
the grandfather, because he went after the ball, which was on the other side of it rolled on the other side of the barbed wire fence,
And he was
the
shot.
guard tower where the military or police were watching
Oh, my
saw
God.
that he went to get the ball, and so they shot him.
Oh, man. Oh, man.
So
And so the idyllic kind of
Yeah.
fake childhood, becomes very harsh very quickly.
yes, for the adults, it was certainly that kind of difficult time.
My goodness. Now, your father painted some not photographs, pictures involving you in these camps, and some of them have gone on to be very famous. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the pictures that involve you?
Well, I think one of them was when we were first going into the camps, that there's a child who's sitting on top of some luggage or suitcases and bundles, and has a little tag on. And the tag was the family number, so that we weren't identified by name, and only by number. So anything that was belonging to a particular family had a designated number. So I had a little tag on, so that in case when we were moving and there were large numbers going onto the trains, that the children wouldn't get lost, or at least if they got lost, at least the number was there and they could locate the family.
But isn't that interesting, the parallels between what was going on with the Nazis putting people into concentration camps, with the numbers and the trains and everything? The same thing was going on here. I can't tell you how wonderful it has been to have you on here today. It has been so important to just learn firsthand some of the things that happened. And we thank you also for joining us in this episode of the Manhattan Neighborhood Network's series on the broader implications of war. Now, if you would like to see, for example, some of the photographs, or some of the paintings, rather, of Henry Sugimoto, then again, you can go to the Japanese American National Museum website and you can see more. You can physically go there. We will have other links up for you. For example, Densho, you can see many, many photographs. For now, we thank you very much for having joined us in this episode, and once again, thank you so much for being here.
You're very welcome.